He did not even look up when he said it. Just bring the coffee, no need to think. The clink of his silver watch against the glass table echoed louder than his voice, and for a moment the entire corner of the restaurant felt colder, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the certainty in his tone. Ethan Caldwell had built his world on certainty, numbers that obeyed him, people who adjusted to him, outcomes that bent before his decisions, and tonight was no different. At least that was what he believed. Clara Bennett stood still for half a second, pen hovering just above the notepad, her posture straight, her expression calm. She did not react, she did not challenge, she simply nodded once and turned away, the movement precise, almost measured, like someone who had long ago learned that silence could carry more weight than words. The restaurant hummed, with quiet wealth, low conversations, expensive laughter, the soft rhythm of cutlery against porcelain. Ethan finally glanced up as she walked away, not because he cared, but because something about her lack of reaction felt off. Most people either rushed to please him or stiffened under his presence. She did neither. She moved like the room belonged to her, like she was not serving it, but observing it, and that irritated him more than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling through the financial dashboard on his tablet, numbers blinking red across the screen. A recent acquisition had not performed the way his board had promised. Projections were off, margins tightening, the kind of mistake he did not tolerate, yet somehow had slipped through, and he hated that more than anything. Losing control was not an option. Losing face was even worse. When Clara returned with his coffee, she placed it gently beside his hand. Not a drop spilled, not a sound made. He tapped the screen with his finger, eyes still on the data. Tell me something, he said casually, as if speaking to no one in particular. If you saw this, what would you fix? A few heads at nearby tables turned, subtle curiosity wrapped in polite indifference. A billionaire asking a waitress for advice. It was almost amusing. Clara did not answer immediately. She glanced at the screen just once. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to see something. And then she spoke softly. Your problem is not the numbers, it is what you chose to ignore before they became numbers. Ethan's fingers stopped mid-tap. The silence that followed was small, but sharp, like a crack forming in glass. He looked up, now fully, his eyes narrowing slightly. Excuse me. She met his gaze, not defiant, not submissive, simply present. You are focusing on the outcome, not the pattern that created it. Her voice was steady, calm, like she was stating something obvious, like she was not talking to a man worth billions, but to a mistake that needed correction. A quiet laugh came from one of the men at the next table. That is bold, he muttered under his breath. Ethan did not laugh. He stared at her longer this time, searching for hesitation, uncertainty, anything that would make her just another person overstepping their place, but there was none. And what pattern would that be? He asked, his tone lower, now less amused, more interested. Clara tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much to say, or whether she should say anything at all. The one where you trust the wrong indicators because they confirm what you already want to believe. The words landed heavier than they sounded because they were not dramatic, they were precise. Ethan felt something unfamiliar, not anger, not yet, but a shift, like the ground under a well-built structure moving just enough to make you notice. He glanced back at the screen, his mind replaying the last few weeks, the decisions, the reports, the meetings. Something about what she said aligned too well with a thought he had dismissed earlier that morning. You are assuming a lot, he said finally. Clara gave a small, almost invisible shrug. I am observing, she replied, then stepped back slightly. Is there anything else you need? He should have dismissed her right then, reduced the moment to nothing more than an odd exchange. But he did not sit, he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. It was not a request, it never was. Clara looked at the chair, then back at him. I am working, she said simply. So am I, he replied, leaning forward, now his voice carrying that familiar authority that usually ended conversations before they began. 5 minutes, a pause not long, but noticeable. She weighed something, not fear, not opportunity, something quieter, more internal. Then she shook her head once. No. The word was soft, but it cut cleaner than any argument. The man at the next table stopped mid-sip. Ethan blinked once, not because he did not understand, but because he was not used to hearing that word directed at him, especially from someone in her position. Do you know who you are saying no to? He asked, not threatening, just genuinely curious. Clara held his gaze. Yes, she said. And that is exactly why I am saying it. For a moment neither of them spoke. The restaurant noise returned, filling the space between them, but the tension did not leave. It simply settled deeper, quieter, more dangerous. Ethan leaned back slowly, studying her, as if she had just rewritten something he thought was permanent. you think you are different," he said. Finally, Clara picked up her notepad again, her movements as calm as when she arrived. "No," she replied. "I just do not pretend you are." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a man who for the first time that evening was no longer looking at his numbers, but at the absence she left in the seat across from him, and wondering why it felt like something important had just shifted without his permission. The next few minutes passed, but Ethan did not move. His coffee sat untouched, the steam slowly fading like the certainty he had walked in with. He replayed her words again, not because he wanted to, but because they refused to leave. "You trust the wrong indicators." He muttered under his breath, the phrase looping in his mind until it connected with something buried beneath layers of reports and assumptions. He opened a different file on his tablet, scrolling faster, now searching not for confirmation, but for contradiction. And there it was, a small inconsistency in the early stage data, something his team had labeled as insignificant, something he had accepted without question because it fit the narrative he preferred. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. He had seen it before and ignored it because it was inconvenient, because it disrupted the clean story his projections told, and now it was costing him more than he liked to admit. He looked up again, scanning the room, until he found her moving between tables, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just altered the way he was looking at his own decisions. "Who are you?" he whispered, not expecting an answer, but knowing one existed somewhere beneath that quiet exterior. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell was not thinking about how to control the situation. He was thinking about how he had misunderstood it, and that realization sat heavier than any loss on his screen. Because numbers could be fixed, but perception, once proven wrong, was harder to rebuild. And somewhere across the room, Clara Bennett continued her shift like nothing had changed, even though everything had. The numbers did not lie, but they also did not explain why his chest felt tighter than usual as Ethan Caldwell stared at the screen again. The red indicators now looked different, not louder, not more urgent, just exposed like something he should have understood earlier. He zoomed in on the early stage metrics, tracing back decisions he had signed off weeks ago. Every line, every approval, every confident nod in boardrooms replaying in fragments inside his head, and in between them her voice, calm, almost indifferent. "You are focusing on the outcome, not the pattern." He exhaled slowly, leaning back, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him. For the first time that evening, he was not thinking about how to fix the loss, he was thinking about how he had allowed it to happen, and that realization did not sit well with him. Across the room, Clara moved from table to table, the same steady rhythm, the same quiet presence, as if the conversation had never existed. A customer asked for a recommendation. She gave one. Without hesitation, another dropped a fork. She replaced it. Before the sound fully settled, nothing about her demanded attention, and yet Ethan found himself watching her again, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something closer to calculation. He picked up his coffee finally, now lukewarm, and took a sip without noticing the taste, his eyes still following her movements until she disappeared briefly behind the service counter. He stood up without fully deciding to do so, the motion instinctive more than intentional, and walked toward the back of the restaurant, ignoring the subtle glances from other guests who were used to seeing him command rooms, not leave them. He stopped just short of the counter, where she reappeared, placing an order ticket down, her fingers moving with practiced precision. "You saw something?" he said, not as a question. Clara did not look surprised. She simply glanced up once, meeting his gaze again, that same calm, unwavering presence. "I saw enough," she replied, wiping her hands lightly with a cloth, as if the conversation required no more preparation. "Then explain it," he said, his tone lower, controlled, but edged now not with arrogance, but with urgency. She tilted her head slightly, considering him again, not his suit, not his status, but him. "You built your decision on short-term growth indicators that were artificially stable," she said. "They looked safe because they were designed to look safe." Ethan frowned slightly. "That is what my analysts confirmed." Clara nodded once. "Yes, because they were reading the same surface you were." She stepped aside, allowing another server to pass before continuing. "You rewarded consistency over volatility, without asking why the volatility disappeared." The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Ethan felt his mind connect the pieces faster. Now the missing fluctuations, the two perfect trend lines, the comfort he had accepted because it simplified the narrative. "You are saying it was manipulated," he said. Clara shook her head. I am saying it was misunderstood, she corrected. Not every mistake is someone else's fault. Sometimes it is just a decision you did not question enough. He held her gaze longer this time, not challenging, not dismissing, but absorbing the difference between accusation and accountability. And you saw that in one glance, he asked. Clara gave a faint, almost unnoticeable smile. No, she said. I saw that you did not. The sentence settled between them heavier than any accusation could have been, because it was not about intelligence, it was about attention. Ethan looked away briefly, his eyes dropping to the edge of the counter, his reflection faint in the polished surface. For a moment, he looked like someone else, not the man who controlled outcomes, but the one who had missed something important. Sit with me, he said again. This time the command softened into something closer to a request. Clara paused, not because she was unsure, but because she was deciding whether it mattered. Then she shook her head once more. No, she said quietly. Word came out before he filtered it. Clara met his gaze again. Because you are not asking to understand, she said. You are asking to confirm. He did not respond immediately, because she was right, and he knew it. The difference was small, but precise, like everything else she had said so far. And if I asked to understand? He pressed. Clara studied him for a moment longer, then stepped back slightly, putting distance between them without breaking eye contact. Then you would not need me to sit down, she said. You would already be listening. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than any complex explanation could have. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and for the first time his posture shifted, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that the edge in his presence softened just a fraction. What would you do? He asked finally. Clara glanced toward the dining area, then back at him. I would go back to the first assumption that felt too convenient, and ask why it was convenient, she said. Then I would follow that answer until it becomes uncomfortable. A small pause, then she added, that is usually where the truth starts. Ethan nodded slowly, not out of agreement, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when something aligns too closely with a thought you avoided. He straightened slightly, his usual composure returning, but altered now, less rigid, more aware. You speak like someone who has done this before, he said. Clara picked up another order, slip her fingers. Steady. People notice patterns when they have lived through enough of them, she replied without elaborating. He watched her for another second, then stepped back, not because the conversation ended, but because it had shifted into something he needed to process alone. As he returned to his table, the noise of the restaurant seemed different, not louder, not quieter, just less important. His tablet still displayed the same data, but now each line felt like a question instead of an answer. He sat down slowly, his mind already moving backward through decisions, through meetings, through moments where he had chosen clarity over curiosity, because it was faster, because it was easier, because it worked until it did not. His fingers hovered above the screen, then moved decisively, opening archived reports, cross-checking early signals, comparing them against the current outcome. And there it was again, the same inconsistency, the same quiet deviation he had dismissed because it did not fit, and now it stood out not as an error, but as a warning he should have followed. He leaned back slightly, a faint exhale, leaving him not frustration, not relief, something in between. Across the room, Clara continued her shift, unchanged, unnoticed by most, but not by him anymore. And as Ethan Caldwell stared at the data once more, he realized something that had nothing to do with numbers or projections. He had not been outperformed, he had been out-observed, and that difference, quietly, precisely, was beginning to change the way he saw everything. The next morning arrived without the clarity Ethan expected. The city moved as it always did, fast, indifferent, precise, but something in him had slowed, not his decisions, not his schedule, but the space between them where certainty used to live. He stood in his office, overlooking the skyline, tablet in hand, the same data, now reorganized, reinterpreted, re-examined, every assumption pulled apart. Like a structure he no longer trusted. His team had already sent updates, revised forecasts, controlled explanations, but none of them addressed what he now understood was the real problem, not the loss, not the numbers, but the way he had allowed himself to believe them without resistance. His assistant stepped in quietly. The board is waiting, she said. Ethan nodded, once placing the tablet down on the glass desk, but he did not move immediately. His reflection stared back at him, faint, but clear enough to notice the difference, not visible to others, not dramatic, just a shift in the way he held himself, like someone who had stopped assuming he was always right and started questioning why he thought he was. He walked into the boardroom moments later. The room filled with familiar faces, confident voices ready to defend decisions, justify projections, maintain the narrative they had built together for years. We have identified the issue. One of them began, already moving into presentation mode, charts lighting up the screen, smooth explanations designed to reassure. It was an external fluctuation not predictable under normal conditions. Ethan raised his hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to pause the momentum. "No," he said simply. The room fell quiet, not because of volume, but because of certainty, the same certainty they were used to, but this time directed at them instead of the market. It was predictable. He continued, his voice calm, controlled. "We just chose not to see it." A few glances were exchanged, subtle discomfort spreading like a ripple. "With respect," another executive said carefully, "the data did not support that conclusion at the time." Ethan looked at him, not with frustration, but with focus. "The data did," he replied. "We just filtered it through what we wanted to believe." He tapped the screen, bringing up the early stage indicators, the same ones he had ignored the night before. "This," he pointed, "was the signal we dismissed because it complicated the story." Silence settled, deeper now, not resistant, just unfamiliar. The meeting shifted not into defense, but into reconsideration, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan was not leading them with answers, he was leading them with questions, questions that did not seek confirmation, but understanding, questions that forced them to look again, not at the outcome, but at the path that created it. Hours later, the meeting ended not with resolution, but with direction, the kind that did not promise immediate recovery, but demanded better thinking. And as the room emptied, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, not out of exhaustion, but reflection. Something had changed, not in the company, not yet, but in him, and that felt more significant than any quarterly result. He stood, finally adjusting his jacket, reaching for his phone. His thumb hovered for a second before he made a decision that did not fit his usual pattern. He canceled his afternoon meetings, all of them, and left the building without explanation. The drive back to the restaurant was quiet, not because the city had changed, but because he was not filling the silence with plans. When he walked in, the lunch crowd had not yet peaked. The same soft lighting, the same quiet rhythm. Clara was there, moving between tables unchanged, as if time had not touched her since the night before. He approached without hesitation this time, not as someone testing, not as someone commanding, but as someone who had something to say. She noticed him before he spoke, not surprised, not impressed, just aware. "You were right." He said the words, simple, direct, without decoration. Clara set down the glass she was holding, turning slightly toward him. "About what?" she asked, not dismissive, just precise. "About the pattern," he replied. "About me." A small pause, not for effect, but for honesty. "I ignored what did not fit." Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded once, not as validation, but acknowledgement. "Most people do," she said. Ethan almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was accurate. "I changed the approach this morning," he continued. "Not the strategy, the thinking behind it." Clara picked up another order slip, glancing at it briefly before responding. "And," she prompted, "it is not fixed," he admitted, "but it is clearer." She gave a faint nod. "That is usually how it starts." He looked at her more carefully, now not trying to figure her out, but trying to understand what made her different. "You have done this before," he said, not as a guess, but as a conclusion. Clara did not answer immediately. She placed the slip down, aligning it neatly with the others, then looked back at him. "I have made the same mistake before," she said quietly. "That is why I recognized it." Ethan absorbed that not as information, but as context. "You studied finance," he added. Clara's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, not defensive, not open, just measured. "I studied how people make decisions," she corrected. "Finance was just where I saw it clearly." He exhaled softly, the pieces aligning in a way that felt less like discovery and more like realization. "Work with me," he said, the offer direct, familiar territory for him, but the tone different now, not transactional, not persuasive, just honest. Clara did not react immediately. She looked at him, not his suit, not his position, but him. "Why?" she asked, the same question he had asked her the night before, and now he understood the weight of it. "Because I need someone who sees what I miss," he answered. "And you do not miss much." A brief silence, then Clara shook her head once. "No," she said gently, not dismissive, not arrogant, just certain. Ethan did not argue. He did not push. He simply nodded once, accepting the answer in a way he would not have 24 hours earlier. "Fair," he said. Clara watched him for a moment longer, then returned to her work, as if the conversation had reached its natural end, and perhaps it had. Ethan stood there for a second, not waiting, not expecting, just present. Then he reached into his pocket, placing something on the table beside her, a business card, simple, clean, his name and number, nothing more. If that changes, he said. Clara did not pick it up immediately. She did not need to. He turned and walked toward the exit, the same man who had entered the night before, and yet not entirely the same. Outside, the city moved around him fast, loud, certain. But he paused for a moment, looking up at the skyline, not as something to control, but as something to understand. And inside the restaurant, Clara finished her shift, the card still on the table untouched, until the last customer left, the last light dimmed. She picked it up, not with urgency, not with curiosity, but with quiet consideration, turning it over once before slipping it into her pocket, not as acceptance, not as rejection, just as possibility, because some things were not meant to be decided in the moment. And as she stepped out into the evening air, the world looked exactly the same, and yet felt slightly different, like a pattern she had seen before, and this time she was choosing to follow it to the end.